Good evening, everyone. My name is Lou Pizzatola. Thank you for joining us. Through his gifts as a writer, Samuel Chip Delany has given readers more than they could ask for, and more often than not, surprised them by giving them not quite what they asked for. His writings are paper-bound, hardcover, and electronic discoveries, spanning the years from the present back to the 1960s. First with works of science fiction, then literary criticism, graphic novels, and memoir, and always filled with his unique insights into writing, reading, sexuality, and society. He's won both Hugo and Nebula Awards and the Pilgrim Award for Science Fiction Scholarship, and the William Whitehead Memorial Award for his lifetime contribution to lesbian and gay literature. His latest book is a work of fiction entitled Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders. And we're pleased that after Chip's reading, he'll be joined in conversation by Kenneth James, who knows our guest's work about as well as anyone. Kenneth first interviewed our special guest as an undergraduate at Cornell in 1987, and he's written introductions to Chip's works. In 1997, he wrote an introduction to a book of essays called Longer View, and later to a book of his selected letters titled 1984. It has been announced Kenneth will edit Samuel R. Delany's collected journals, which will likely run to 5 volumes, so you will be seeing that fairly soon. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Samuel Chip Delany and Kenneth James. I'm grateful to Lou for ticking some items off of my own agenda, so there's less standing between all of you and the main event. My name is Kenneth James. It's a great privilege and pleasure to converse with the special guest for tonight's Pride Month event at Barnes & Noble. Chip Delany has a career that I liken to the trajectory of a bright celestial object, perhaps a comet, complete with this long, impressive, fuzzy white tail, passing various planets and moons, genres and readerships, and leaving them forever changed by its transit. We're here tonight to celebrate the 50th year of this career, but we're also here specifically to celebrate, on that 50th anniversary, the publication of Chip's latest novel, Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders. Now, I've studied Chip's work and written about it, and for me, reading this new novel has felt like watching the comet return on its great elliptical trajectory, swooping back through the genres, creating an interplay between the sorts of sexual explorations on which Delany has focused in recent years, recent decades, really, and the speculative work with which he first made his name. The result is a novel that gathers over its 800 plus pages astonishing emotional power. Having read the initial reviews of this book, I now know that I'm not alone in my experience that upon finishing this book, I wept. And I'm no sentimental reader. No other book has ever done that to me before in my life, not one. And the initial reviews of the book seem to suggest that this is a common response to this new novel. It takes an extraordinary writer indeed to tell a story with such emotional force, and Samuel Delany is one of this country's greatest. Chip will now read us a passage from this novel. Afterwards, I will ask him some questions about the book and his other work, and then we'll open up discussion to everyone here who might have a question. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Samuel R. Delany.
Well, thank you very much, Lou, and thank you very much, Ken. Those were quite extraordinary introductions. I hope I can live up to him. Just what do you need to know to follow this particular very brief 10-minute section that I'm going to read from Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders. A gay adolescent who works as a garbage man's helper in the town of Diamond Harbor on the Georgia coast, 17-year-old Eric Jeffers has gone out to Gilead Island to stay overnight with friends Jay and Mex in the decaying mansion once owned and lived in by Robert Kyle III, a black multimillionaire who started the Kyle Foundation to improve the lives of black gay men living on the mainland. That night, beside Jay, Mex, and Eric, no one is in the huge old house except the housekeeper Hugh and Jay's uncle Shad, a bitter, mentally unstable old man confined to a wheelchair. In the middle of the night, Eric wakes and decides it would be fun to explore the decrepit 50-room mansion naked. And when he crosses between the couches and armchairs scattered through the great second-floor sitting room, from beside and behind him came a sound like a squeaking wheel. Naked in the great room, Eric turned. Crouching, he staggered back 6 or 7 inches. At the same time, chills enveloped him, so many and so thoroughly they did not feel like something within his body, but like waves and waves around him, rolling through him, across him, over him. He closed his eyes tightly and opened them again. What he'd seen was Shad in his wheelchair directly behind him. Only with a blink, it was a huge Shad, a Shad 3 times as large as life. But that was impossible. Was it Hugh in his dressing gown, sitting in some great chair, watching him? The figure in the moonlight was, Eric made himself stand up straight, 20 feet away in the corner. It was not directly behind him, but it was big, and he realized now it wasn't a seated figure at all. Again outside, a wind made the sash grate against the sill. A branch beyond the window moved before the moon, and smoky light drifted back and forth over the immense statue. Eric stepped forward. A very large bear? Bull? Boar? Was it stuffed? Real? He stepped closer. Nor was it rearing on its hind leg, one claw high, one claw, no, not a claw, but a hand out, as if to sweep in the world. It was a bull, only it squatted like a man, or kneeled anyway, one knee down. The other, up before it, was some immense bird's claw, big enough to grip Eric's head. Those were wings back in the shadow, but not bird's wings. They looked like a bat's, only not any bat Eric had ever seen. Somehow, because he hadn't been looking for it, he'd missed it in its dim corner. But moving with the branch outside the window, moonlight kept making the forward of the 2 arms move. At last he was right in front of it. It was a minotaur, or something like one, winged and kneeling on one leg in the corner. Between its thighs, the one it kneeled on seemed human enough, as was its great foot. He could see the huge length of its tail, like a serpent thick as a thigh, rolling and coiling behind it. Knowing it was a statue, Eric reached out and up, expecting to feel the rough fur of ancient taxidermy on its forearm. He touched the huge, extended hand. It was metal, black with tarnish. Eric's heart began to still. Its pedestal represented rock and branches with a shell among them, and a starfish, as if it kneeled on a length of beach. Bent before him, the feathered knee shone where the patina had worn away. He imagined generations of children during holidays in this hall, at Christmas and high summer, Halloween and Easter, feeling the parts that extended, wearing the stain from its bronze, so that the yellow metal showed through, turned platinum by the moon. Eric backed away, breathing more easily. At last he turned, walked into the archway, and started down the stairs. Then, with a hand on the heavy banister, and started up the stairs. Then, with a hand on the heavy banister and the energy of the night's adventure, he began to run. Maybe I'll come out 1,000 years from now. And came out at the head of the broad railing in a small room, small compared to the room below, which, as he turned to orient himself, he realized was round. About the walls, crowded bookshelves alternated with shelf-to-roof windows. 2 of the windows had shades pulled down, one only a few inches, one at least 2.5 feet. Beneath them, under moonlight, through old panes, he could see the sea. On a wide desk that fit, as if it had been made for the room, against the curved wall, stood an orrery. Eric knew neither the word nor what the object was. It looked, however, like some complex, oversized medieval gyroscope, sitting on a snake coiled over the back of the great cast tortoise, its base. Supported over it were rings and spheres, clear and scrolled, with scales and rods projecting from the crystal at its center. Now, on those rods, he began to recognize moons and planets. That one, because of the rings, he realized was Saturn. He reached for it, started to move one globe, and all the other rods and globes began to sweep at the same time, some faster, some slower. He jerked his hand back, as if the material universe around him might topple and tumble from his disturbance. The model stopped moving. Turning away, Eric looked at the books on the shelves. No, the room wasn't round, it was octagonal. The ones that stood in moonlight, so that he could read the titles and authors embossed in dark leather, were 3 volumes of François Villon by Tiffany Thayer. Travels in Arabia Deserta, Volumes 1 and 2 by Charles M. Doty. Die Welt aus Wille und Vorstellen, also in 2 volumes, by Arthur Schopenhauer, several unnumbered volumes by Benedict de Spinoza, Ethica, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Principia Philosophiae Cartesianae, Tractatus de Intellectus Emendatione, Cogitata Metaphysica, Korte voorhanden van God, de Mensch en desself Welstand, and still other books by Lessing, Goethe, and Novalis. Shelf after shelf of books bore the same titles in worn gold letters, Comédie Humaine. Under it were 2 volumes of Le Juif Errant, and 3 of Les Mystères de Paris, and 6, 7, 8 of Les Sept Péchés Capitaux. Momentarily, the room flared silver, flickered, and thunder filled it up, then fumbled away. Eric looked out the window. He looked out one of the others and was surprised to see drops on the glass. A storm started? On one shelf directly in front of him, he saw a framed picture. No, with the moonlight coming in behind, he realized it was a glassed-over newspaper photo. Across the top of the page, with its feathered edge, it said, "The Hemmings Herald." The headline read, "Heiresses Meet on Gilead." The date was 1923. Each woman stood with a man. The man beside the first was a solid-looking fellow in Western clothing who could easily have been an American Indian. Black braids hung at the side of his head. The man beside the second and the man beside the third were both distinctly African American. Were they servants? Eric wondered, though the tall and heavily braceleted one had her hand on the black man's arm, which made Eric doubt it. Below was a line of names: Mabel Dodge Lewin, Tony Lewin, Nancy Kennard, Harry Prouder, Doris Pitkin, Robert Kyle. And white light filled up the windows both sides of the wall. As he looked, the photograph turned black. In the rectangle of glass over it, now Eric saw the reflecting books and bookshelves on the wall behind. He stepped backwards, then turned to look at the other bookshelves as lightning lit them. Thunder filled up the room. The lightning faded. For moments, Eric thought the tower was cracking and crumbling, and moments later, again, he was looking at the three couples smiling under glass. I'm not sure if any of you have know who those names are. Google them when you get home. You might find it of interest. Okay.
So my first question for Chip is, what was the genesis of this project? Was there a major impetus for Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders? And if so, could you tell us what it was?
Well, that's actually a fairly easy one to answer. The idea for the book goes back before I wrote my very, very first novel, to when I was a kid. In 1958, as he later wrote about it in another novel, in 1958, Hurricane Lolita swept from Florida to Maine. And the book, of course, was a great bestseller. And in 1960, Vladimir Nabokov was interviewed, and I read the interview. And one of the things he talked about, the interviewer said, "Well, what does it feel like to have written this shocking novel about an adult man who has an affair with a 12-year-old girl?" And Nabokov said, "There's nothing shocking about this novel, really. If you really wanted to write a shocking American novel, what you would do is you would write a book about an interracial couple. And this interracial couple got married. They had children. Their children or them never had anything to do with drugs. They never had any problems with the police. They simply grew old and lived happily and to a ripe old age with their children and grandchildren around them. And that would be the truly shocking American novel. And this stayed with me from the time I was 18 through all the various 20-odd, 22, 23 novels that I've written. And then back in the at the beginning of the 21st century, it occurred to me, if I'm ever going to write the novel I want to write about this, I better start now. So I did. I started working on it, and for 7 years I worked on Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders. There's a little difference, however, from Nabokov's version of it. The particular couple, the interracial couple, are a gay couple of working class guys who live on the coast of Georgia. And they meet when they are respectively 17 and 19. And they live together and stay together happily for the next 60 or 70 years. And basically, that was the impetus, and it grew directly from Nabokov's comment. And I have tried. And I gather from what some of the reviewers have said, they do indeed find some of it shocking.
Well, you've described the book as taking place in a pornotopia. Could you describe what a pornotopia is? Could you talk about that in relation to this?
What is a pornotopia? Pornotopia is just a quick term to sort of genreize the kinds of literature that we have. Comedy takes place in the world of commedia. Tragedy takes place in the world of tragedia, and pornography takes place in the world of pornotopia, and realism takes place in the world of realizia, or whatever you want to call it. And when you think about it, and our lives take place in some way that's a place of all three. I get up in the morning. I walk into the kitchen. I open the refrigerator door. The salami falls out on the floor. I pick it up. The door goes and swings and hits me in the side, knocks me over, and I knock the jar of capers from last night off onto the floor from the kitchen table. This happens to all of us all the time. But when we write it in a novel, we say, I went and I opened the refrigerator door, and I got the half and half out and put it on the table, and we just leave all the slapstick comedy that takes place around us. We leave it out, and in the same way, commedia and tragedia, that's the world of comedy. And tragedia is the place where everything goes wrong that could possibly go wrong. And pornotopia, of course, is the place where any relationship can become immediately sexualized. You walk into the business office and you smile at the secretary, and she smiles at you, and the next thing you know, you're having riotous sex on the desk. This is the world of pornotopia. Every once in a while, something actually occurs from pornotopia, but not all that frequently. And so pornotopia. And so, yes, when you write about explicit sex, often in the same way, you have to do a little juggling to make it sort of fit into the story. And those little generic jugglings that you have to do create the texture of pornotopia. And so that's basically all it is. Pornotopia is a place where pornography happens. If you do it properly, people don't realize you're in pornotopia any more than they realize that you're in tragedia when you write a tragedy. They only recognize when they come out and have seen all the bodies scattered around the stage in the last 5 minutes of the last act. Oh, this took place in tragedia, and so that's how all of these work. And it's just a quick way of implying that.
Well, a number of reviewers have noticed that there is an extraordinary amount of gay sex in this novel, and of an extraordinary variety. Roger Bellin, in his review in the LA Review of Books, makes this terrific point. He says that it's very unlikely that any single reader is going to be turned on by everything that happens in the novel, and he comes up with a terrific term for describing this libidinal estrangement as a description of how the novel works on the reader. And I guess my question would be, how do you see your ideal reader's approach to this material?
Well, if my feeling is broad, and I have a whole range of possible of what I think are more than acceptable responses. If it turns you on, go with it. That's one of the possible responses. Enjoy it on that level. However, as Bellin said, nobody could possibly be turned on by all of it, because some of it's diametrically opposed to other. Basically, I want the reader to look at it as though it is things that happen to the characters. You regard it in the same way as if they took a walk down by the ocean. They had sex in this particular way at this particular time, and that you pay attention to it and see if you can see things that happen in the way that it occurs that tell you about their character. You tell you who they are. The sex is not there just to turn people on. If it does turn them on, that I see that as a very secondary result. I have nothing against that happening. I think that's fine. I think a lot of artists, especially in the early half of the 20th century, have felt that somehow a sexual response undercuts the aesthetic response. Auden used to feel this way, I know, and I don't. I don't. I think that there's nothing to prevent you from having both responses, either at the same time or 5 minutes apart, as the case may be. So that's my answer there.
Well, there's also an enormous amount of material in the novel about food.
Yes.
There's a tremendous focus on food, and there's almost a sense that the whole novel is a kind of exploration of appetite, human
Yes.
appetite. And I'm curious about what you had in mind with this particular focus.
Well, it is a book about appetites, about all sorts of appetites. Appetites for food, appetites for certain kinds of experiences, which include the sexual. And that's because we are the concatenation and the intersection of all of our appetites. I think that's one of the things that we are. And learning how to deal and negotiate those appetites. Some of them have to be held in. Some of them can be explored. Some of them you can have great fun with. Some of them, all of them require some responsibility. I think, and that's and that's what and so that's what the experience is, because that's a lot of the experience of life. Now, I think there is a great deal of sex. Let's go back to the sex thing. And as you said, there's also a great deal about food. There must be, there are at least half a dozen full recipes given, in the course of the novel about how to do everything from southern grilled ribs to coleslaw to you name it. Mashed turnips, et cetera. All these things are how to eat okra, boiled okra. All of this stuff, information is there, and that's because you have to learn about the foods that that are around you. You have to learn how to negotiate them, and people do. But that's again because that's what I think people are constituted by. They're constituted by their various appetites, and this is all that should be there. As I started to say, there is a great deal of sex. I don't think there is as much as some of the reviewers would lead you to believe, though. One young man in a sort of blog that he wrote said at least 70% of the novel is taken up with sex. I don't think so. It's probably, in an 800-page novel, I would be really surprised if you actually counted. There are more than 125 pages, that deal explicitly and directly with sex, which is a lot for an 800, which is more than 10%. But it's not, it's not more than half. It's not even, it's not a quarter. It's not a third. And I think people sort of, because the proportion is larger than they're used to, it tends to make it, the first time they go through it, it seems like there's even more, and I think it gets, there's one of the reviewers, and again, something that could only exist in the world of the internet, they go on about one particular odd kind of sex, and finally somebody says, well, there is actually, after they've discussed it for 7 or 8 comments back and forth, 5 or 6 pages, somebody mentions, well, there isn't any of that sex in the novel. It's only referred to, and it just happens off stage. It never happens explicitly. But again, if you read the conversation about it, you would think that it was, it took up vast numbers of pages in the book. So this is the way a lot of that tends to work.
Well, going with just the issue of vast number of pages, a number of critics have mentioned that the sheer length of the book and the amount of time that it does immerse us in the texture of the lives of the two main characters is a major part of what gives the book its emotional power. And I guess the question I've really been wanting to ask you is, what is your hope in creating such an immersive experience in the lives of these two men in particular?
Well, they are the kinds of people who are not usually written about. They're two working class men. One of them is actually illiterate. One of them literally cannot read and write. I think the way the novel has progressed historically, I think, is to sort of each time writers and artists go around, they work to expand the circle of compassion. That's the way I talk about it when I talk about it in my classes. And to bring in more and more people. You read early novels, something like John Gay's The Baker's Opera, what became the Threepenny novel that became The Baker's Opera. There is no compassion for the working class at all. The working class is presented as thieves and layabouts and people that you shouldn't, that you don't let into your house. They're all going to rob you blind if you give them half a chance, and if you give them any more than that, they will probably rape your sister. That's who the working class is, and is presented in these early novels. And then finally, people began to think, well, maybe a little bit of compassion could be spared for the working class. And if somebody was going to be hung, let's say on the next morning, you could at least shed a tear, for his wife and children, something like that. But again, you look at Balzac's scheming peasants, even as late as Balzac. You have sympathetic characters who are the children of peasants who are trying to better themselves. But the peasants themselves in Balzac are just they're monsters. Séchard in Les Illusions Perdues is the old printer. He schemes against his son, his every relative. He tries to get pent money out of everyone. He has no sympathy for anyone, and is an evil old guy. And his son loves him, or claims to love him, but this is the way the early novel dealt with the working class, and each time you move on, you bring in more and more people. The novel, by the time you get up to George Orwell or people like that, suddenly the working class, there's sympathy for the working class and other people as well. And so you've got to, and I'm just trying to expand the circle of compassion just by a little more. Not a lot more, just a little bit more. And allow people who have a couple of odd sexual kinks into that circle. And you said, and I in a way, that's a wonderful compliment that you found yourself very, very moved by the end of the novel, by the history of these two guys. Well, that's kind of the payoff, that's your way. That suggests to me that I might have come near some success in what I was trying to do.
I'll address a final question to you here, then we can pass this on to the audience. You're a critic as well as a novelist, and in your Paris Review interview in their Art of Fiction series last summer, you said that for the last 40 years of this 50-year career as a writer, your major project has been that of promulgating a, quote, more sophisticated idea of discourse, end quote. Can you tell us how this new novel relates to that project?
Well, again, I don't think that's fundamentally a difficult thing to do. The way you promulgate a more sophisticated notion of what discourse is fundamentally by promulgating a more sophisticated and nuanced notion of what human beings are, what human beings are capable of doing. You know, because discourse has entirely to do with language, and if you can talk about it, you can then, you are then doing it. And so one of the things that it tries to do, one of the reasons the book is as long as it is and very focused on these two characters, and really on one of the two characters. It's not all focused on, it's focused mostly on Eric Jeffers. And it is, and we see all sorts of, I try to show nuances and sides of his character and show them exhaustively. I go along with Mann's notion that nothing is truly interesting except the exhaustive. And so I try to be exhaustive about it. And in such a way that it will hold the reader's interest. And from the reviews, nobody seems to have had too much trouble reading the book. They say it's a hard book to read, and I finished it the next day, So it's a strain. It's hard not on the level of, not on the level of vocabulary and syntax, but it's difficult perhaps to read on some of the content that you find yourself roller coastering through. But if anything, it seems to draw people on through the actual text even faster, for which I'm very glad. But as I said, as long as you are recomplicating the notion of what is allowed within the range of the human, and you show it in that way. Who was it who said that to explain, to understand everything and to sympathize with everything, you just have to explain it well enough. And so that's what you have to do. You have to explain stuff that might ordinarily be dismissed, and get people sort of thrown out of that circle, in such a way that we can follow it, that we can say, gee, if I was in, there, what is it? Therefore, but for the grace of, whoever. Therefore, but for the grace of Deus sivi natura, go I.
Well, thank you very much. This would be a great place to open up this discussion. So please, if you have any questions for